Today is the 15th of September, and this is the 57th time we are speaking on the Majjhima Nikaya Suttas. And tonight we come to Sutta 138, Udesa Vibhanga Sutta, the exposition of a summary. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There the Blessed One addressed the monks thus, "Monks, Venerable Sir," they replied. The Blessed One said, "Monks, I shall teach you a summary and an exposition. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, Venerable Sir," the monks replied. The Blessed One said, "Monks, a monk should examine things in such a way that while he is examining them, his consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally, nor stuck internally, and by not clinging he does not become agitated. If his consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally, nor stuck internally, and if by not clinging he does not become agitated, then for him there is no origination of suffering, of birth, aging and death in the future." Stop it for a moment. So here basically the Buddha says to end the round of rebirths, the monk's consciousness must not be distracted and not stuck internally, and not clinging so that he does not become agitated. So basically three things. That is what the Blessed One said. Having said this, the Sublime One rose from his seat and went into his dwelling. Then soon after the Blessed One had gone, the monks considered, "Now friends, the Blessed One has risen from his seat and gone into his dwelling after giving a summary in brief, without expounding the detailed meaning. Now who will expound this in detail?" Then they considered, "The Venerable Mahakachana is praised by the teacher and esteemed by his wise companions in the holy life. He is capable of expounding the detailed meaning. Suppose we went to him and asked him the meaning of this." So as before in Sutta 133, they went to the Venerable Mahakachana and asked him to explain this saying of the Buddha. Then he said, "You should have asked the Buddha. The Buddha is like the hardwood of the Bodhi tree, and he's humble. He says he's cannot compare to the Buddha, but they still asked him to explain. Then he said, "Then listen, friends, and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, friend," the monks replied. The Venerable Mahakachana said, "How, friends, is consciousness called distracted and scattered externally? Here, when a monk has seen a form with the eye, if his consciousness follows after the sign of form, is tied and shackled by gratification in the sign of form, is fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of form, then his consciousness is called distracted and scattered externally. Similarly, when he has heard a sound with the ear, smelt an odor, tasted a flavor, touched a tangible, cognized a mind object, if his consciousness follows after the sign of the external sense objects, is tied and shackled by gratification in the sign of the external sense objects, is fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of the external sense objects, then his consciousness is called distracted and scattered externally. And how, friends, is consciousness not distracted and scattered externally? Here, when a monk has seen a form with the eye, if his consciousness does not follow after the sign of form, is not tied and shackled by gratification in the sign of form, is not fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of form, then his consciousness is called not distracted and scattered externally. When he has heard a sound with the ear, smelt an odor, tasted a flavor, touched a tangible, cognized a mind object, if his consciousness does not follow after the sign of the external sense object, is not tied and shackled by gratification in the sign of the external sense object, is not fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of the external sense object, then his consciousness is called not distracted and scattered externally. Stop here for a moment. So here, remember Kachana says that if this monk, he sees either a form or hears a sound or smells an odor, or and he follows after the object, is gratified by the object, then his consciousness is called distracted and scattered externally. For example, somebody say this monk, he sees a beautiful girl and his attention is drawn by this beautiful object. Then he pays attention. So his mind is distracted. Instead of putting it, the Buddha says that our mind should always be on the four objects of sati, four objects of recollection, the body, feeling, mind, and Dhamma, and not on external sense objects. External sense objects are the bait of Mara. Mara is always trying to catch us at the six sense doors. So if he does not pay too much attention to forms, sounds, smells, tastes, touch, and thoughts, then his mind is collected. His mind is focused, so it is not distracted and scattered externally. And how, friends, is the mind called stuck internally? Here, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. A monk enters upon and abides in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with delight and pleasure born of seclusion. If his consciousness follows after the delight and pleasure born of seclusion, is tied and shackled by gratification in the delight and pleasure born of seclusion, then his mind is called stuck internally. Again, with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, a monk enters upon and abides in the second jhana, which has self-confidence and singleness of mind, without applied and sustained thought, with delight and pleasure born of concentration. If his consciousness follows after the delight and pleasure born of concentration, then his mind is called stuck internally. Again, with the fading away as well of delight, a monk abides in equanimity, and mindful and fully aware, still feeling pleasure with the body. He enters upon and abides in the third jhana, on account of which noble ones announce, he has a pleasant abiding, who has equanimity and is mindful. If his consciousness follows after the equanimity, then his mind is called stuck internally. Again, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, and with the previous disappearance of joy and grief, a monk enters upon and abides in the fourth jhana, which has neither pain nor pleasure, and purity and utter purity of mindfulness and equanimity. If his consciousness follows after the neither pain nor pleasure, is tied and shackled by gratification in the neither pain nor pleasure, is fettered by the fetter of gratification in the neither pain nor pleasure, then his mind is called stuck internally. That is how the mind is called stuck internally. I'll stop here for a moment. So here it is explained that when this monk attains the first jhana, and then if he clings to the delight and pleasure, piti and sukha in the first jhana, then his mind is called stuck internally. Similarly, in the second jhana, if his mind clings to the delight and pleasure, so he cannot progress, he's also said to be stuck internally. And in the third jhana, if he clings to equanimity, he is stuck internally. In the fourth jhana, he clings to this neither pain nor pleasure. This neither pain nor pleasure is also equanimity. So you see, in the third jhana, the equanimity is quite pronounced. In the fourth jhana, it is even more pronounced, because in the definition of the fourth jhana, it is said now that when one enters the fourth jhana, and abides in the fourth jhana, he has utter purity of mindfulness and equanimity. So, if a monk attains the jhanas and he clings to it, then he cannot progress. So he is said to be stuck internally. So there are some monks who always talk a lot about this, saying that you can easily get attached to the jhanas. But this is not true, because in the Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 44, it is said, if you have a look, it's on page 402. Page 402, the previous page 401, it says, the underlying tendency to lust underlies pleasant feeling. The underlying tendency to aversion underlies painful feeling. But then he also says, does the underlying tendency to lust underlie all pleasant feeling? And then this Dhammadina, this Arahant says, the underlying tendency to lust does not underlie all pleasant feeling. Paragraph 27, the underlying, let me see, 28. Okay. The underlying tendency to lust does not have to be abandoned in regard to all pleasant feeling. And then here, friend Visakha, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. A monk enters upon and abides in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with delight and pleasure born of seclusion. With that, he abandons lust, and the underlying tendency to lust does not underlie that. So you see here, in the first jhana, even though it's a very pleasant state, you have this piti and sukha, which is delight and pleasure or happiness. But in some other sutta, the Buddha says, even this piti and sukha, delight and pleasure, is a subtle perception. It's not as strong as later books say. Later books say this piti can be overwhelming. But in the suttas, the Buddha says piti and sukha is just a subtle perception. So also when a person enters the first jhana, the mind is focused, strong. So here it says very clearly, there is no underlying tendency to lust for it. Then why does a monk cling to the first jhana? You see, in the one of the previous suttas we read, the Buddha says that he always tells his disciples to surmount whatever attainment they have and go to a higher level and keep going until they have finished their work. So in that sutta, the Buddha says that when a monk attains the first jhana, he should not stay at that stage. He should surmount it and go to the next stage, which is the second jhana. And then after the second jhana, he should surmount the second jhana again and go to the third jhana. After attaining the third jhana, he should surmount it again and go to the fourth jhana. After he attains the fourth jhana, there are two ways to go. One is to attain higher jhanas, which is the arupas, arupa jhana. So after that, the Buddha says he should surmount the fourth rupa jhana and attain the base of infinite space. And then after that, the Buddha says, surmount that and attain the base of infinite consciousness, surmount that and attain the base of nothingness, surmount that again and attain the base of neither perception nor non-perception. And even that high stage, the Buddha says, surmount it and attain the cessation of perception and feeling. Then when a monk attains cessation of perception and feeling, and when he comes out of it, he becomes liberated. The other way, in some other suttas, it is explained, after attaining the fourth jhana, the Buddha says to attain the recollection of past lives is one of the abhinyas. You can consider it as a psychic power. The ability to recollect many, many lifetimes, thousands of lifetimes, and even world cycles of lifetime. Then after that, surmount that and attain the divine eye and see beings passing away and taking rebirth according to karma vipaka, and understand the working of karma vipaka. Then after that, use the memory of the past Dhamma that he has learned. Then the monk should contemplate the Four Noble Truths and attain liberation. So whatever stage you attain, the Buddha says, keep on surmounting it until you have attained liberation, which is the destruction of the asavas, the taints. So this one, where a monk attains the first jhana and is tied and shackled by gratification of the first jhana, this normally happens to external sect ascetics. External sect ascetics, when they have attained these jhanas, they don't know how to progress after that, because they don't know the Dhamma. They can't attain the various Aryan stages, so they get stuck there. So that is why they stay in that level. So that is called stuck internally. That means not progressing. Stuck at that stage. So similarly with the second jhana, third jhana, and the fourth jhana. And how, friends, is the mind called not stuck internally? Here, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. A monk enters upon and abides in the first jhana. If his consciousness does not follow after the delight and pleasure born of seclusion, is not tied and shackled by gratification in the delight and pleasure born of seclusion, is not fettered by the fetter of gratification in the delight and pleasure born of seclusion, then his mind is called not stuck internally. Again, with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, a monk enters upon and abides in the second jhana. If his consciousness does not follow after the delight and pleasure born of concentration, then his mind is called not stuck internally. Again, with the fading away as well of delight, a monk enters upon and abides in the third jhana. If his consciousness does not follow after the equanimity, then his mind is called not stuck internally. Again, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, a monk enters upon and abides in the fourth jhana. If his consciousness does not follow after the neither pain nor pleasure, is not tied and shackled by gratification in the neither pain nor pleasure, is not fettered by the fetter of gratification in the neither pain nor pleasure, then his mind is called not stuck internally. That is how the mind is called not stuck internally. So this follows from before. So here, if this monk is a Buddhist monk, a disciple of the Buddha, that having attained the jhanas, he does not get stuck there because he does not stay at that level. He goes progressively higher and higher stages until he is liberated. So he does not cling to all these jhanas. How, friends, is there agitation due to clinging? Here, an untaught ordinary person who has no regard for noble ones and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, who has no regard for true men and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, regards material form as self, or self as possessed of material form, or material form as in self, or self as in material form. That material form of his changes and becomes otherwise. With the change and becoming otherwise of that material form, his consciousness is preoccupied with the change of material form. Agitated mental states born of preoccupation with the change of material form arise together and remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is obsessed, he is anxious, distressed, and concerned, and due to clinging, he becomes agitated. Similarly, he regards feeling, perception, volition, consciousness as self, or as belonging to self, or self as in the aggregates, or the aggregates as in the self. Those aggregates of his change and becomes otherwise. With the change and becoming otherwise of those aggregates, his consciousness is preoccupied with the change of the aggregates. Agitated states of mind born of preoccupation with the change of the aggregates arise together and remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is obsessed, he is anxious, distressed, and concerned, and due to clinging, he becomes agitated. That is how there is agitation due to clinging. Stop here for a moment. Here, the Buddha says that an untaught, ordinary person, a putujana, who doesn't know the Dhamma, he tends to cling to the five aggregates. But the five aggregates, which is basically body and mind, here it says the five aggregates are material form or body, then feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness. So this body and mind, these five aggregates are basically body and mind. So when this body and mind changes, then he becomes agitated because he clings to the body and the mind. So he becomes distressed and agitated. That is how there is agitation due to clinging. And how, friends, is there non-agitation due to non-clinging? Here a well-taught noble disciple who has regard for noble ones and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma, who has regard for true men and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma, does not regard material form or body as self, or self as possessed of material form, or material form as in the self, or self as in material form. That material form of his changes and becomes otherwise. With the change and becoming otherwise of that material form, his consciousness is not preoccupied with the change of material form. Agitated mental states, born of preoccupation with the change of material form, do not arise together and remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is not obsessed, he is not anxious, distressed, and concerned. And due to non-clinging, he does not become agitated. Similarly, he does not regard feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness as self, or self as possessed of these aggregates, or the aggregates as in the self, or the self as in these aggregates. Those aggregates of his changes and becomes otherwise. With the change and becoming otherwise of those aggregates, his consciousness is not preoccupied with the change of the aggregates. Agitated mental states born of preoccupation with the change of the aggregates do not arise together and remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is not obsessed, he is not anxious, distressed, and concerned. And due to non-clinging, he does not become agitated. That is how there is non-agitation due to non-clinging. Stop here for a moment. So here an Aryan disciple, having understood the Dhamma, does not cling to the five aggregates. So when the five aggregates change, as they must change, then he does not become agitated. Friends, when the Blessed One rose from his seat and went into his dwelling, after giving a summary in brief without expounding the detailed meaning, that is, monks, a monk should examine things in such a way that while he is examining them, his consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally, nor stuck internally, and by not clinging, he does not become agitated. If his consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally, nor stuck internally, and if by not clinging he does not become agitated, then for him there is no origination of suffering, of birth, aging, and death in the future. I understand the detailed meaning of this summary to be thus. Now, friends, if you wish, go to the Blessed One and ask him about the meaning of this. As the Blessed One explains it to you, so you should remember it. Then the monks, having delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Mahakachana's words, rose from their seats and went to the Blessed One. After paying homage to him, they sat down at one side and told the Blessed One all that had taken place after he had left, adding, "Then, Venerable Sir, we went to the Venerable Mahakachana and asked him about the meaning. The Venerable Mahakachana expounded the meaning to us with these terms, statements, and phrases." And the Buddha said, "Mahakachana is wise, monks. Mahakachana has great wisdom. If you had asked me the meaning of this, I would have explained it to you in the same way that Mahakachana has explained it. Such is its meaning, and so you should remember it." That is what the Blessed One said. The monks were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. That's the end of the sutta. So here, basically, this sutta is talking about 3 steps to enlightenment. One is not to allow the mind to be scattered out to external sense objects, and not to be stuck at various levels of meditation. If you cling to various stages of meditation, then you cannot progress. And then also, the third thing is not to cling to the five aggregates, which are basically body and mind. So if you don't cling to the five aggregates, when they change as they will, then you will not become agitated. And that is the way to practice to end the cycle of birth, aging and death. Now we come to the next sutta, 139, Arana Vibhanga Sutta, the exposition of non-conflict. Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There the Blessed One addressed the monks thus, "Monks, Venerable Sir," they replied. The Blessed One said, "Monks, I shall teach you an exposition of non-conflict. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, Venerable Sir," the monks replied. The Blessed One said, "One should not pursue sensual pleasure, which is low, vulgar, coarse, ignoble, and unbeneficial. And one should not pursue self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. The middle way discovered by the Tathagata avoids both extremes, giving vision, giving knowledge. It leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to Nibbana. One should know what it is to extol and what it is to disparage, and knowing both, one should neither extol nor disparage, but should teach only the Dhamma. One should know how to define pleasure, and knowing that, one should pursue pleasure within oneself. One should not utter covert speech, and one should not utter overt, sharp speech. One should speak unhurriedly, not hurriedly. One should not insist on local language, and one should not override normal usage. This is the summary of the exposition of non-conflict." I'll stop here for a moment. So here the Buddha says, these few things amounts to non-conflict. So here the Buddha says, don't pursue sensual pleasure or the opposite, self-mortification. Instead, practice the middle way taught by the Buddha. And also the Buddha says that in teaching the Dhamma, one should not praise some people or disparage, talk bad about other people. And then one should know pleasure, and one should pursue pleasure within oneself. Later you find there are two types of pleasure. One is pleasure from external things, and the second type of pleasure is from internal. So the Buddha says that we should pursue the pleasure within oneself. Then one should not utter covert speech, secret speech, disguised speech. And one should not utter sharp speech openly. In public, you criticize somebody, you hurt somebody. And then also in speaking the Dhamma, one should speak unhurriedly, not hurriedly. And then lastly, concerning language, one should use normal language. Okay, one should not pursue sensual pleasure which is low, vulgar, coarse, ignoble, and unbeneficial. And one should not pursue self-mortification which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. So it was said. And with reference to what was this said, the pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desires, low, vulgar, coarse, ignoble, and unbeneficial, is a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the wrong way. Disengagement from the pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desires, low, vulgar, coarse, ignoble, and unbeneficial, is a state without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the right way. The pursuit of self-mortification, painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial, is a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the wrong way. Disengagement from the pursuit of self-mortification, painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial, is a state without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the right way. So it was with reference to this that it was said, one should not pursue sensual pleasure which is low, vulgar, coarse, ignoble, and unbeneficial, and one should not pursue self-mortification which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. The middle way discovered by the Tathagata avoids both these extremes, giving vision, giving knowledge. It leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to Nibbana. So it was said. And with reference to what was this said, it is just this noble eightfold path, that is, right view, right thoughts, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right recollection, and right concentration. So it was with reference to this that it was said, the middle way discovered by the Tathagata avoids both these extremes and leads to Nibbana. Now stop here for a moment. So here the Buddha said that in the spiritual path, one should not pursue sensual pleasure. Sensual pleasure is pleasure regarding the five chords of sensual pleasure, taking delight, enjoy the enjoyment, the gratification of forms, sounds, smells, tastes, and touch. And this is the enjoyment of worldly people. But even some ascetics, they also indulge in sensual pleasure, like some of the external ascetics during the Buddha's time. And the Buddha says this is low, vulgar, coarse, ignoble, and unbeneficial. And then the opposite is self-mortification. Many ascetics during the Buddha's time, they practice self-mortification. They just torture their body, and they think that is the path to enlightenment. For example, they go naked, and because they go naked all the time, at night they will shiver because of the cold, and during the day they are burned by the sun. Or some of them, they practice starving themselves, eating very little. Or some people, they put up their arm and never put down their arm. Year after year, they lift up their arm. All this is unbeneficial. So the Buddha says to practice the middle way, or the middle path. And the middle path of the Buddha is the noble eightfold path. It is not the middle path in the worldly sense. In the Buddha's teachings, the middle way is the noble eightfold path, consisting of these 8 factors just mentioned. One should know what it is to extol and what it is to disparage, and knowing both, one should neither extol nor disparage, but should teach only the Dhamma. So it was said. And with reference to what was this said, here monks, how monks does there come to be extolling and disparaging and failure to teach only the Dhamma? When one says, all those engaged in the pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desires, low, vulgar, etc., and unbeneficial, are beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and they have entered upon the wrong way. One thus disparages some. When one says, all those disengaged from the pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desires, low, vulgar, etc., are without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and they have entered upon the right way, one thus extols some. When one says, all those engaged in the pursuit of self-mortification, painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial, are beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and they have entered upon the wrong way, one thus disparages some. When one says, all those disengaged from the pursuit of self-mortification, painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial, are without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and they have entered upon the right way. One thus extols some. When one says, all those who have not abandoned the fetter of being are beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and they have entered upon the wrong way, one thus disparages some. When one says, all those who have abandoned the fetter of being are without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and they have entered upon the right way, one thus extols some. That is how there comes to be extolling and disparaging, and failure to teach only the Dhamma. And how, monks, does there come to be neither extolling nor disparaging, but teaching only the Dhamma? When one does not say, all those engaged in the pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desires have entered upon the wrong way, but says instead, the pursuit is a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the wrong way, then one teaches only the Dhamma. When one does not say, all those disengaged from the pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desires have entered upon the right way, but says instead, the disengagement is a state without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the right way, then one teaches only the Dhamma. When one does not say, all those engaged in the pursuit of self-mortification have entered upon the wrong way, but says instead, the pursuit is a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the wrong way, then one teaches only the Dhamma. When one does not say, all those disengaged from the pursuit of self-mortification have entered upon the right way, but says instead, the disengagement is a state without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the right way, then one teaches only the Dhamma. When one does not say, all those who have not abandoned the fetter of being have entered upon the wrong way, but says instead, as long as the fetter of being is unabandoned, being too is unabandoned, then one teaches only the Dhamma. When one does not say, all those who have abandoned the fetter of being have entered upon the right way, but says instead, when the fetter of being is abandoned, being also is abandoned, then one teaches only the Dhamma. So it was with reference to this that it was said, one should know what it is to extol and what it is to disparage, and knowing both, one should neither extol nor disparage, but should teach only the Dhamma. Let's stop here for a moment. So here the Buddha is saying, we should teach the Dhamma. One thing gate ulang. So here the Buddha says, we just teach the Dhamma without saying, if you do this, then those people who follow this wrong path, they are practicing wrongly and they will suffer for it and all that. The Buddha says just to say that this is the wrong path, and if anyone who so this is quite clear from here what the Sutta says, but unfortunately it's very difficult to do this. And if you look into the Buddha's suttas, sometimes the Buddha also says very bluntly that certain teacher is wrong. For example, there's one sutta where the Buddha scolds Makali Gosala Putta. He says Makali Gosala Putta is a fool, just like a fish trap leads all the fish into a net and they cannot come out from it. So in the same way, the Buddha said that Makali Gosala Putta is leading all beings, because this Makali Gosala Putta says there's no such thing as karma vipaka. So the Buddha says he's leading all his followers into the realms of woeful, the woeful realms of rebirth. So it's not easy just to teach the Dhamma without saying, without being a bit personal. But anyway, those who sometimes, but then of course it's best not to mention any names when the Dhamma is taught, not to be personal. We can say this is right, this is wrong, or those who practice this is practicing the right path, those who are practicing that is practicing the wrong path, that is although that contradicts what is said here, but it's not so bad as to get personal and mention names. So teaching the Dhamma, we should never mention names if possible. One should know how to define pleasure, and knowing that one should pursue pleasure within oneself. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said? Monks, there are these 5 chords of sensual pleasure. What 5? Forms cognizable by the eye, sounds, odors, flavors, tangibles, cognizable by the body, that are wished for, desired, agreeable and likable, connected with sensual desire and provocative of lust. These are the 5 chords of sensual pleasure. Now the pleasure and joy that arise dependent on these 5 chords of sensual pleasure are called sensual pleasure, a filthy pleasure, a coarse pleasure, an ignoble pleasure. I say of this kind of pleasure that it should not be pursued, that it should not be developed, that it should not be cultivated, and that it should be feared. Here monks, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, a monk enters upon and abides in the first jhana, the second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. This is called the bliss of renunciation, the bliss of seclusion, the bliss of peace, the bliss of enlightenment. I say of this kind of pleasure that it should be pursued, that it should be developed, that it should be cultivated, and that it should not be feared. So it was with reference to this that it was said, one should know how to define pleasure, and knowing that one should pursue pleasure within oneself. I'll stop here for a moment. So in the previous sutta, we read that when you attain the jhanas, you should not cling to it. But here the Buddha says that this last part, one should pursue pleasure within oneself. This pleasure within oneself is this pleasure that is derived from the jhanas, which the Buddha calls the bliss of renunciation, the bliss of seclusion, the bliss of peace, the bliss of enlightenment. Why? Because in some other sutta, the Buddha says these 4 jhanas can bring you to attain, help you to attain the 4 Aryan fruits, Sotapanna, first fruit, Sakadagamin, the second fruit, Anagamin, the third fruit, and Arahanthood, the 4th fruit. So the Buddha here is encouraging the monks to indulge in the bliss of jhana, but then also the Buddha has said in some other sutta not to stay there, but having attained them, to surmount them one by one until you have attained the final goal of the holy life, which is the liberation or destruction of the asavas. But then we see from the suttas that even after the arahants have finished their work, that they constantly abide in the jhanas. Is blameless because they have finished their work. One should not utter covert speech, and one should not utter overt sharp speech. So it was said. And with reference to what was this said? Here monks, when one knows covert speech to be untrue, incorrect and unbeneficial, one should on no account utter it. When one knows covert speech to be true, correct and unbeneficial, one should try not to utter it. But when one knows covert speech to be true, correct and beneficial, one may utter it, knowing the time to do so. Here monks, when one knows overt sharp speech to be untrue, incorrect and unbeneficial, one should on no account utter it. When one knows overt sharp speech to be true, correct and unbeneficial, one should try not to utter it. But when one knows overt sharp speech to be true, correct and beneficial, one may utter it, knowing the time to do so. So it was with reference to this that it was said, one should not utter covert speech, and one should not and one should not utter overt, sharp speech. This covered speech is, as I mentioned, is secret speech, disguised speech, and overt speech is to speak openly. So here the Buddha says, concerning this covered speech, if it is true it is and correct and beneficial, then you may utter it, but know the time to do so. And similarly for overt, sharp speech. So for example, somebody is following the wrong Dhamma, following the wrong teacher, following a teacher that is teaching wrong Dhamma. So if you want to help him, then you can speak to him secretly. This is covert speech, which is true, correct, and beneficial. So you don't, when you want to say something true about another teacher who is not teaching correctly, you don't say in the open. You say in the open, it becomes a big issue, antagonize a lot of people. But then, depending, because if you are not personal, then it's okay. But if it's something personal, then it's best not to speak in public. So the Buddha says, if it is beneficial for that person, as I mentioned, somebody is following a wrong teacher, is wasting his time, and he's learning the wrong things. For example, he follows this Makali Gosala Putta, who is teaching that there is no Kama Vipaka. Then you want to help him not land up in the woeful plane of rebirth. Then you tell him secretly that this is not correct. Then it's okay, but it's beneficial. On the other hand, overt, sharp speech, if it's true and beneficial, in other words, in public, if you say something that is true and is beneficial for people, then it's all right to do so. For example, in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha says, if a monk knows that somebody teaches a Dhamma and says that is Dhamma, then the Buddha says, knowing it, we should speak out even in public against this Adhamma which is taught in the name of the Buddha's teachings. So the Buddha encourages us to be forthright when it comes to helping people. It's true and it's beneficial. It's all right to speak openly, sharp speech, but also we only talk about Dhamma. We try not to get personal. Okay. One should speak unhurriedly, not hurriedly. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said. Here, monks, when one speaks hurriedly, one's body grows tired, and one's mind becomes excited. One's voice is strained, and one's throat becomes hoarse, and the speech of one who speaks hurriedly is indistinct and hard to understand. Here, monks, when one speaks unhurriedly, one's body does not grow tired, nor does one's mind become excited. One's voice is not strained, nor does one's throat become hoarse, and the speech of one who speaks unhurriedly is distinct and easy to understand. So it was with reference to this that it was said, one should speak unhurriedly, not hurriedly. Stop here for a moment. So here, especially when Dhamma is being taught, it's not easy to understand. So if one speaks too fast, people cannot follow. Then it's hard to understand. In fact, we see from the suttas very often when the Buddha teaches, he repeats what he says sometimes a few times, just to make it sink into the listener's mind. So this is nothing. One should not insist on local language, and one should not override normal usage. So it was said. And with reference to what was this said? How, monks, does there come to be insistence on local language and overriding of normal usage? Here, monks, in different localities, they call the same thing a dish by patti, or a bowl, patta, or a vessel, vita, or a saucer, sirava, or a pan, Daropa, or a pot Pona, or a monk Hana, or a basin Pisila. So whatever they call it in such and such a locality, one speaks accordingly, firmly adhering to that expression and insisting only this is correct, anything else is wrong. This is how there comes to be insistence on local language and overriding normal usage. And how, monks, does there come to be non-insistence on local language, a non-overriding of normal usage? Here, monks, in different localities, they call the same thing a dish, or a bowl, or a vessel, etc. So whatever they call it in such and such a locality, without adhering to that expression, one speaks accordingly, thinking, these venerable ones, it seems, are speaking with reference to this. This is how there comes to be non-insistence on local language and non-overriding of normal usage. So it was with reference to this that it was said, one should not insist on local language and one should not override normal usage. So basically what the Buddha is trying to say here, I think, is that we should use the language where people can understand, not to insist on certain expressions. If we expand this a bit now, that is not only particular things, but the language itself. In the Dhammapada, verse 102, the Buddha said, one sentence of the doctrine which brings happiness to a person who understands is better than 100 stanzas consisting of meaningless words. So whatever we say must be understood. Otherwise, it is meaningless words. So, for example, if we teach these suttas that we are reading now in Pali, people won't understand. If we insist on using Pali, then we just chant the whole sutta in Pali. You can listen to me, but you won't understand what I'm saying, right? So it is important to use the language where people can understand. If we chant we do the chanting of paritas and all that, it is also important to know what you are chanting. If you are chanting the Pali chants and you don't know the meaning, then it's waste of time. It's important to know the meaning. So in a way, that shows that if you chant the Pali chants in the language that you are familiar with, it's also okay. If you want to chant it in English, you want to chant it in whatever language you understand, it's okay. The important thing is to understand it. Here, monks, the pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desires, low, vulgar, etc., is a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the wrong way. Therefore, this is a state with conflict. Here, monks, disengagement from the pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desires, low, vulgar, and beneficial, is a state without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the right way. Therefore, this is a state without conflict. Here, monks, the pursuit of self-mortification, painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial, is a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the wrong way. Therefore, this is a state with conflict. Here, monks, disengagement from the pursuit of self-mortification, painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial, is a state without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the right way. Therefore, this is a state without conflict. Here, monks, the middle way discovered by the Tathagata avoids both these extremes, giving vision, giving knowledge. It leads to peace, direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to Nibbana. It is a state without suffering, and it is the right way. Therefore, this is a state without conflict. Here, monks, extolling and disparaging and failure to teach only the Dhamma is a state beset by suffering, and it is the wrong way. Therefore, this is a state with conflict. Here, monks, not extolling and not disparaging and teaching only the Dhamma is a state without suffering, and it is the right way. Therefore, this is a state without conflict. Here, monks, sensual pleasure, a filthy pleasure, a coarse pleasure, an ignoble pleasure is a state beset by suffering, and it is the wrong way. Therefore, this is a state with conflict. Here, monks, the bliss of renunciation, the bliss of seclusion, the bliss of peace, the bliss of enlightenment is a state without suffering, and it is the right way. Therefore, this is a state of without conflict. Here, monks, covered speech that is untrue, incorrect, and unbeneficial is a state beset by suffering. Therefore, this is a state with conflict. Here, monks, covered speech that is true, correct, and unbeneficial is a state beset by suffering. Therefore, this is a state with conflict. Here, monks, covered speech that is true, correct, and beneficial is a state without suffering. Therefore, this is a state without conflict. Here, monks, overt, sharp speech that is untrue, incorrect, and unbeneficial is a state beset by suffering. Therefore, this is a state with conflict. Here, monks, overt, sharp speech that is true, correct, and unbeneficial is a state beset by suffering. Therefore, this is a state with conflict. Here, monks, overt, sharp speech that is true, correct, and beneficial is a state without suffering. Therefore, this is a state without conflict. Here, monks, the speech of one who speaks hurriedly is a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the wrong way. Therefore, this is a state with conflict. Here, monks, the speech of one who speaks unhurriedly is a state without suffering. Therefore, this is a state without conflict. Here, monks, insistence on local language and overriding of normal usage is a state beset by suffering. Therefore, this is a state with conflict. Here, monks, non-insistence on local language and non-overriding of normal usage is a state without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the right way. Therefore, this is a state without conflict. Therefore, monks, you should train yourselves thus. We shall know the state with conflict, and we shall know the state without conflict, and knowing these, we shall enter upon the way without conflict. Now, monks, Subhuti is a clansman who has entered upon the way without conflict. That is what the Blessed One said. The monks were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. That's the end of the sutta. So this last part, the Buddha mentioned this Subhuti. This name is often heard in Mahayana sutras. If you look at the note 1263, let me see. Subhuti 1263. Venerable Subhuti was the younger brother of Anathapindika and became a monk on the day Jeta's grove was offered to the Sangha. The Buddha appointed him the foremost disciple in two categories, those who live without conflict and those who are worthy of gifts. Now, so here at the last part, the Buddha says, those states without conflict, there are a few. The first one is disengagement from the pursuit of sensual pleasures. This is a state without conflict. Then the second one is disengagement from the pursuit of self-mortification. Then the third one is the middle way taught by the Buddha. The fourth one is not extolling and not disparaging, teaching only the Dhamma is a state without conflict. And then another one is the bliss of renunciation, the bliss of seclusion, the bliss of peace, the bliss of enlightenment, which is basically the bliss of jhana. That is a state without conflict. And then covered speech that is true, correct, and beneficial. That means speech in secret or disguise that is true and beneficial is a state without conflict. And then overt, sharp speech, if it is true and beneficial, is also a state without conflict. And then speaking unhurriedly, especially in teaching the Dhamma, is a state without conflict. And then the last one, non-insistence on local language and non-overriding of normal usage is a state without conflict. So we have gone through the explanation of all the various states of conflict mentioned in this sutta. Okay, anything to discuss?
Sometimes one express something and you think it's true, and you yourself think it's beneficial, and you might fall on deaf ears. So sometimes you come to it hurriedly and like impatiently, and that is of course the cause for conflict. But then this part beneficial is very subjective, because I think it is beneficial, but I wouldn't know whether it is beneficial because I try to insist. So how do I overcome that conflict?
Sometimes you have to see whether the other party considers it beneficial or not. If the other party considers it beneficial and appreciate what you say, then it's okay to say it. If you say something which you think is beneficial, but the other party does not accept it as beneficial, there is no point to speak.
So in other words, we just, if it's not listening to you, I think put a stop to it for some other time. And I think another question, what's the difference between Dhamma and Sadhamma?
Dhamma and Adhamma.
No. Adhamma, there's another place, there's another word for Sadhamma. What is the difference with Dhamma?
Sadhamma is true Dhamma. True Dhamma, okay? And true Dhamma refers to the original suttas of the Buddha. Because there is one sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha says, if any monk says that the Buddha taught such and such, then the Buddha said you should not accept it and you should not reject it. You should compare it with the suttas, meaning the original suttas of the Buddha. If it agrees with the original suttas, then you can accept it to the Buddha's words. So you can see from there that Sad Dhamma, true Dhamma, refers to the original suttas. Adhamma is what is contradictory to the original suttas. And you will find that later books, there's usually this contradiction. For example, the Mahayana Sutras, or the Abhidhamma, or the commentaries. Although they have some Dhamma inside all of them, but it is mixed with Adhamma. And unless you are very familiar with the suttas, the original Dhamma or the Saddhamma, then you will not know the contradiction. That's why you have to be very familiar with the Buddha's original words in the suttas, and then only when you read other books, later books, then you can find, you can notice the contradiction. Okay, shall we end here?